My name is mailed and I'm 41 years old. I used to think that if nothing was broken, nothing needed fixing. That belief carried me through most of my adult life. It sounded reasonable, responsible, mature. It kept me moving forward without asking too many uncomfortable questions. And for a long time it worked. At least on the surface. I was 41 when I realized that the problem wasn't that something had gone wrong. The problem was that nothing ever really began. From the outside, my life looked stable, predictable, even admirable to some people. I had a long-term relationship that had survived more than a decade. A job that paid well enough to avoid panic. Friends who trusted me. Parents who were proud. A calendar full of obligations and routines that made my days blur together in a way that felt safe. No chaos and no scandals and no dramatic failures. Just quiet continuity. And yet, there was a feeling I couldn't name. Not sadness. Not anger. Not despair. Something flatter. Like living with the volume permanently turned down. I didn't wake up unhappy. I woke up neutral. And that neutrality followed me everywhere. Mornings began with the same movements. Coffee, shower, news I didn't care about, clothes chosen without thought. Evenings ended the same way. Dinner, screens, conversations that skimmed the surface of things we had already said 100 times. We weren't fighting. We weren't distant. We were efficient. I remember the first moment I noticed the silence inside myself. It wasn't during an argument or a crisis. It was a random Tuesday evening. We were sitting on the couch, watching something neither of us had chosen deliberately. I looked over at her and felt something unexpected. Gratitude. And then something heavier. Relief. Because nothing was required of me in that moment. That scared me. I realized I wasn't relaxed because I felt connected. I was relaxed because I felt invisible. I pushed the thought away immediately. People don't question good lives, I told myself. They protect them. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed busy. I stayed agreeable. I stayed quiet about the things that didn't rise high enough to be called problems. But questions have a way of returning when ignored. They don't shout. They wait. Over the next months, I noticed small changes. I stopped initiating conversations about the future. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know what I wanted anymore. I nodded along to plans that felt abstract, distant, unreal. Someday became a word we used often, and somehow never defined. I caught myself avoiding moments of stillness. Long walks without headphones felt uncomfortable. Sitting alone in silence made my chest tighten. Not with anxiety, with awareness. One evening, while washing dishes, I asked myself a question that stopped me cold. If nothing changed, would I be okay living this exact life for the next 20 years? The answer came faster than I expected. And I didn't like it. I didn't tell anyone about that question. Not her. Not my friends. Not even myself, fully. I filed it away under overthinking and moved on. But something shifted after that. I started noticing the compromises I had normalized, the opinions I softened, the excitement I deferred. I realized how often I chose peace over honesty. Not because honesty would hurt someone, but because it would disrupt the image of stability I had worked so hard to maintain. I had learned early in life that being dependable was valuable. That being low maintenance made relationships easier. That needing less meant asking less of others. So I became good at it. Too good. The problem with becoming low maintenance is that eventually, you stop noticing when your needs disappear entirely. I didn't feel trapped. That's what made it dangerous. Traps are obvious. Comfort is subtle. The first crack appeared during a conversation with an old friend. We hadn't seen each other in years. He asked how I was doing, and for once, I didn't default to the automatic answer. I don't know, I said. He looked surprised. So, not great, he asked. I thought about it. No, I said slowly. Not bad either. He nodded, but his expression changed. That's usually when people start asking questions, he said. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. I listened to the quiet breathing beside me. I stared at the ceiling. And for the first time, I allowed a dangerous thought to fully form. What if this life isn't wrong, but it isn't mine anymore? The thought didn't come with panic. It came with clarity, and that made it impossible to ignore. I didn't act on it. Not yet. But once a truth is named, it doesn't go back to sleep. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing my internal resistance more clearly. How often I said yes while feeling a quiet no. How often I avoided expressing preferences because it felt unnecessary. How rarely I asked myself what I actually wanted. I had spent years being the steady one, the reasonable one, the man who didn't rock the boat. And now, I was starting to realize something unsettling. I didn't know who I was outside of that role. One evening, standing alone in the kitchen, I admitted something I had never said out loud. "I don't feel alive," I whispered. Not dramatically, just factually. That was the moment this story truly began. Not with a decision, not with a confession, but with an awareness that refused to leave. In the next part, I'll tell you what happened when I finally tried to talk about this feeling, and why saying it out loud changed everything. Because once silence breaks, it doesn't do so gently. Awareness doesn't change things immediately. It lingers. It watches. It waits for the right moment to make itself unavoidable. After that night in the kitchen, I didn't feel relieved. I felt exposed. Like I had said something sacred out loud and now had to live with the echo. 4 days, I carried the sentence with me. I don't feel alive. It didn't accuse anyone. It didn't demand action. It simply existed, and that was enough to unsettle everything. I started noticing how carefully I edited myself. How often I paused before speaking. How frequently I chose words that would keep things smooth rather than true. At work, I caught myself staring at my screen without absorbing anything. Tasks that once felt manageable now felt strangely heavy. Not because they were difficult, but because they felt meaningless. I wasn't burnt out. I wasn't depressed. I was disconnected. That distinction mattered. One evening, she asked a simple question. "Are you okay?" she said, without suspicion or urgency. Just curiosity. Normally, I would have smiled and said yes. Instead, I hesitated. Not long. Just long enough for the truth to lean forward. "I think I'm tired," I said. She nodded. "Me too," she replied. And the conversation ended there. That was the first moment I realized how easily honesty can retreat if not invited properly. I didn't blame her. She wasn't ignoring me. She simply didn't know there was something to hear. Days passed. Then weeks. The feeling didn't fade. It sharpened. I began to recognize a pattern in my life. Whenever something felt uncertain, I defaulted to endurance. Whenever something felt uncomfortable, I minimized it. Whenever I felt a need forming, I dismissed it as unnecessary. I had mistaken self-erasure for maturity. The next attempt came unexpectedly. We were having dinner. Nothing special, nothing tense. She was talking about a plan months in advance. A vacation idea. A future scenario. I listened, nodded, and felt something tighten in my chest. "Can I say something?" I asked. She paused, surprised. "Of course," she said. "I don't know how I feel about the future lately," I said carefully. She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked. I searched for words that wouldn't sound dramatic. "That I feel disconnected from it," I said. "Like I'm going through motions without knowing why." She leaned back in her chair. Concern, not anger, crossed her face. "Are you unhappy?" she asked. The question landed heavier than expected. I wanted to answer clearly. I couldn't. "I don't think so," I said slowly. "But I don't think I'm fully here either." Silence settled between us. Not hostile. Just uncertain. She nodded eventually. "That's vague," she said gently. She wasn't wrong. We finished dinner quietly. Later, She reached for my hand as we watched television. The gesture was familiar, comforting, and strangely insufficient. That night, I lay awake again. But this time, my thoughts were sharper. I realized something uncomfortable. I had learned how to talk around truth without ever touching it. I had been afraid that naming my emptiness would require action. And I wasn't ready for that. The following weeks were marked by internal tension. I became more observant, more aware, less patient with myself. I started writing again. Not creatively, just honestly. I wrote down sentences I had never allowed myself to finish. I am bored with my own life. I feel safe but not fulfilled. I don't know what I want, and that terrifies me. Seeing the words on paper made them real. And reality has weight. One afternoon, an old memory surfaced unexpectedly. I remembered being younger, before responsibility became my defining trait. How easily I once felt excited. How naturally I expressed opinions. How little I worried about being inconvenient. I didn't miss youth. I missed permission. That realization followed me into my next conversation with her. This time, I didn't try to soften the edges. "I think I've been disappearing slowly," I said one night. She looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I think I've built a life that works," I said. "But I don't think it reflects who I am anymore." Her expression changed. Not to anger, to fear. "Are you saying you want to leave?" she asked. The question startled me. "No," I said immediately. "I'm saying I don't know who I am right now." She nodded, but I could tell she was unsettled. Change, even undefined change, threatened stability. "I don't want things to fall apart," she said quietly. "Neither do I," I replied. And that was the truth. But another truth existed alongside it. Avoiding collapse can sometimes prevent growth. The tension didn't explode. It settled. Like humidity before a storm. We became careful with each other. Kinder. More restrained. As if we were walking around something fragile without naming it. And I began to understand something important. Honesty doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes it brings responsibility. I wasn't just naming discomfort anymore. I was confronting the possibility that comfort had cost me myself. One night, sitting alone, I asked a question that frightened me more than any before. What if staying is the reason I feel this way? I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. The question itself changed everything. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment when observation turned into choice, and why clarity, once it arrives, is impossible to negotiate with. Because some truths don't ask for permission. They wait for courage. Once a question takes root, it changes how you move through the world. I hadn't decided anything yet. But I could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. After asking myself whether staying was the reason I felt disconnected, I noticed a shift. Not outward. Inward. I became more aware of resistance. Not conflict. Resistance. The subtle tightening when I agreed to something I didn't believe in. The quiet fatigue that followed conversations where I had edited myself too carefully. I started observing my own behavior like an outsider. Why did I avoid expressing preferences? Why did disagreement feel dangerous? Why did peace matter more than truth? The answers weren't flattering. They were familiar. I had learned early that being agreeable kept things stable. That harmony was a form of safety. That being needed was more important than being known. So I had built a life around those lessons. And now, those same lessons were suffocating me. One afternoon, I left work early without explanation. I didn't go home. I walked. No destination. No music. Just movement. As I walked, I noticed how rarely I let my mind wander without direction. How often I filled silence with distraction. That day, I let the silence speak. Thoughts surfaced slowly. Memories. Regrets. Unasked questions. I realized how long it had been since I felt excited about anything not already planned. How predictable my reactions had become. How safe. How small. That realization didn't hurt. It sobered me. I sat on a bench and watched people pass. Strangers moving with purpose. Or confusion. Or energy. I wondered what it felt like to want something deeply again. Not responsibly, not reasonably, but honestly. That night, I tried to imagine my future. Not the version we discussed. Not the one that looked appropriate, but the one that felt authentic. The image refused to form, and that scared me. I wasn't afraid of change. I was afraid of emptiness. I realized something else that night. I had outsourced my sense of direction. To routines. To expectations. To being needed. Without those, I didn't know how to orient myself. A few days later, she asked if something was wrong. Not accusing. Just attentive. "You seem distant," she said. "I am," I replied. And this time, I didn't soften it. We sat quietly. The silence felt heavier now. Not empty. Loaded. "I don't know what to do," I said finally. She looked at me carefully. "What are you afraid of?" she asked. The question landed deeper than she knew. "I'm afraid that if I'm honest, everything will change," I said. She nodded slowly. "I'm afraid of that too," she said. That moment revealed something painful. We were both protecting stability, not each other. I didn't want to hurt her, but I was hurting myself. And that harm had started to leak into the space between us. Over the next weeks, I felt split. Part of me wanted to pull back, to retreat into routine, to silence the questions again. Another part refused. It had tasted clarity, and clarity doesn't retreat easily. I noticed my patience thinning. Not with her, with myself. I grew restless, unsettled. I felt like a man standing in a doorway too long, blocking the entrance, blocking the exit. One evening, during a trivial disagreement, something unexpected happened. I spoke honestly, without cushioning. "I don't want to pretend anymore," I said. The word surprised us both. She looked at me, startled. "Pretend what?" she asked. "That everything is fine," I said. "When I don't feel fine." Her eyes filled with something between fear and sadness. "Are you saying I'm not enough?" she asked. The question hurt, because I knew how it sounded. "No," I said quickly. "I'm saying I don't know who I am anymore." We sat with that. No resolution. No relief. That night, I didn't sleep. I realized something unavoidable. Honesty had crossed a threshold. I couldn't go back to silence, even if I wanted to. I understood then that this wasn't about leaving or staying. Not yet. It was about ownership of my inner life. I had spent years being responsible for everything except myself. And now, responsibility was calling my name. In the early morning hours, I admitted something quietly. If I don't choose something soon, something will be chosen for me. That thought terrified me more than change ever could. The next part begins with the first deliberate step, and the consequences of taking it. Because awareness becomes action whether we're ready or not. And once action begins, nothing remains theoretical. There is a moment when waiting becomes a choice. I didn't recognize it at first. I thought I was still observing, still processing, still being careful. But in truth, I was deciding, slowly, to stop hiding. The first deliberate step wasn't dramatic. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't make an announcement. I created space. I began spending time alone intentionally. Not avoiding her. Not withdrawing. Just claiming hours that belonged to no one else. At first, that space felt unfamiliar. Almost guilty. As if solitude required justification. I walked without purpose. Sat in cafes without checking my phone. Let thoughts arrive without correcting them. What surfaced surprised me. Not dissatisfaction with her, but dissatisfaction with how little of myself I had allowed into my own life. I saw how often I deferred. How rarely I asserted. How deeply I had internalized the belief that wanting more was selfish. That belief had shaped everything. I had confused self-sacrifice with love, silence with loyalty, endurance with strength. And now, I was starting to question all of it. One afternoon, while sitting alone, I wrote something I had avoided for years. I am allowed to want a life that feels like mine. The sentence looked simple, but it felt radical. When I finally spoke again, I chose honesty without explanation. "I need more space," I said one evening. She looked at me carefully. "How much?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I replied. The uncertainty unsettled her. It unsettled me too. "I'm not leaving," I added quickly. "I'm trying to understand myself." She nodded, but I could see the shift. Space introduces fear, because space invites possibilities. Over the next weeks, our dynamic changed. Subtly, conversations became cautious. Affection became deliberate, not absent, measured. We were no longer moving automatically, and that awareness made everything heavier. One night, she asked a question I had been dreading. "Are you still in this?" she asked. I hesitated, and that hesitation answered her before I could. "I don't know," I said. The words felt cruel, but they were honest. She looked away. "I don't want to be with someone who doesn't know," she said quietly. I understood her. Certainty feels like safety. "I'm not trying to hurt you," I said. "I'm trying to stop hurting myself." Silence followed. Not angry. Final. That was the night I realized that honesty always has a cost. And avoiding that cost doesn't make it disappear. In the days that followed, I felt both lighter and more afraid. Relief from saying what I had been carrying. Fear of what it might lead to. I noticed how often I had delayed conversations in the past. How frequently I had chosen timing over truth. Now, timing no longer felt like a valid excuse. We talked more openly. Not to resolve things, but to understand them. I learned how scared she was of uncertainty. How much she valued continuity. How deeply she had trusted stability. I didn't judge her. I shared those values once. But something had shifted. I wasn't willing to trade my presence for peace anymore. One evening, she asked directly. "Are you thinking about leaving?" she said. The question hung between us. Heavy. Unavoidable. "I'm thinking about choosing myself," I said. She flinched. As if I had spoken a language she didn't recognize. "That sounds like leaving," she said. "Sometimes it is," I replied. I didn't say it to provoke. I said it because it was true. That night, I slept alone. Not because we had agreed to anything, but because distance had arrived on its own. Lying in the quiet, I realized something painful. Clarity doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it brings separation. But it also brings alignment. I knew then that I couldn't return to who I had been, even if staying would be easier. In the morning, I woke with a calm I didn't expect. Not peace. Resolve. I wasn't rushing toward an ending, but I was no longer avoiding one. The next part begins with a conversation that changed the shape of everything, not because of what was said, but because of what could no longer be unsaid. Because once honesty becomes the foundation, pretending collapses under its own weight. The hardest conversations don't begin with anger. They begin with stillness. The morning after we slept in separate rooms, nothing felt broken. That was the most unsettling part. She made coffee. I watched the steam rise from the mug. We moved around each other politely, carefully, as if any sudden motion might shatter something invisible. "I don't want to live like this," she said quietly. Not accusing. Not emotional. Just clear. "Neither do I," I replied. And for the first time, our agreement didn't feel comforting. We sat at the table. No phones. No distractions. The conversation we had been circling finally demanded attention. "I need to know where this is going," she said. I took a breath. "I don't know if I can give you certainty right now," I said. Her shoulders tensed. "That's not fair," she said. She wasn't wrong. Certainty is often what love asks for. "I've spent years being certain for other people," I said. "I don't know how to do that anymore without losing myself." The words sounded selfish. They were honest. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I can't build a future on 'I don't know,'" she said. Silence followed. Heavy. Unforgiving. I realized then that honesty doesn't negotiate. It clarifies. "I don't want to hurt you," I said. "I know," she replied. "And that's what makes this worse." We talked for hours. Not arguing. Remembering. tracing where things had shifted, acknowledging what we could no longer deny. There were moments of warmth, moments of grief, moments of silence where words felt intrusive. At some point, she cried. Quietly. I didn't reach for her. Not because I didn't care, but because comfort felt dishonest. When the conversation ended, nothing was resolved, but something was accepted. That afternoon, I packed a small bag. Not dramatically, not angrily, just enough for a few days. Standing at the door, I felt something unexpected. Grief, yes, but also relief. Not relief from her, relief from pretending. I hope you find what you're looking for, she said. I hope you do too, I replied. The door closed softly. No finality, just separation. The first night alone was disorienting. The silence felt vast, unstructured, unforgiving. Without routine, I didn't know where to place my attention. Without shared time, I felt exposed. But beneath the discomfort, something else emerged. Presence. I noticed my breath, my thoughts, the absence of performance. I wasn't trying to be anything for anyone, and that felt terrifying and liberating. I walked the city that night. No destination, no urgency. Every familiar street looked different, not because it had changed, because I had. I thought about how often I had mistaken stability for fulfillment, how easily I had accepted comfort as enough. Now, comfort was gone, and I was still standing. Days passed. I moved through them slowly, deliberately. I didn't rush to fill the space. I let loneliness speak. It said things I needed to hear, that I had avoided myself for a long time. That distraction had been my refuge. That intimacy without presence is just proximity. I missed her. That truth didn't disappear. But I didn't regret the conversation. Regret comes from dishonesty, not loss. One evening, I sat alone and acknowledged something painful. Leaving doesn't mean the relationship failed. Sometimes it means the self finally arrived. That thought didn't erase the sadness, but it gave it meaning. I understood then that freedom isn't the absence of attachment. It's the absence of self-betrayal. In the next part, I'll tell you about the aftermath, the quiet days that followed, the unexpected encounters, and the moment I realized that solitude can either empty you or introduce you to who you actually are. Because endings don't conclude stories. They strip them down. And what remains is where truth begins. After the leaving comes the silence. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that echoes. But the kind that settles into your bones. The days after I moved out blurred together. Morning light through unfamiliar curtains. Coffee in a mug I hadn't chosen. Rooms that didn't yet know my habits. I wasn't heartbroken in the way people expect. I was disoriented, as if my internal compass had been removed. Without shared routines, time felt unstructured, too open. Every hour required intention. At first, I filled the space automatically. Long walks. Work tasks stretched longer than necessary. Background noise that pretended to be company. But distraction loses its effectiveness quickly. Silence always catches up. At night, memories surfaced without invitation. Not just of her, of myself. Moments I had avoided revisiting. Choices made out of fear rather than desire. Words swallowed to maintain peace. I realized how much of my identity had been relational. Defined by usefulness. By reliability. By being the steady presence. Alone, those definitions collapsed. And without them I felt exposed. I wasn't lonely for her alone. I was lonely for certainty. Certainty about who I was. Certainty about where I was going. Certainty about whether this pain meant something. Some nights, doubt arrived unannounced. What if I had overreacted? What if honesty had been selfish? What if comfort had been enough after all? Those questions didn't accuse. They whispered. And whispers are harder to ignore. I didn't fight them. I listened. I learned that doubt isn't weakness. It's grief searching for familiarity. Over time, something subtle shifted. The silence stopped feeling hostile. I began to notice small things. The rhythm of my breath. The way my body relaxed when no one expected anything from me. The relief of not performing emotional stability. I slept deeper. Not longer, but deeper. I started journaling without intention. Not to solve anything. Just to record what was happening inside me. Patterns emerged. I wrote often about pressure, expectation, the weight of being the reasonable one. I saw how often I had prioritized being needed over being known. How much approval had guided my decisions. These realizations didn't shame me. They explained me. One afternoon, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years. We talked briefly, casually. "You seem different," they said. I paused. "I think I am," I replied. The words surprised me. They felt true. Different didn't mean happier or freer. It meant more present. There were still moments of longing. Moments when I reached for my phone instinctively. Moments when I imagined what she would say. But those moments passed. They didn't control me. I began to understand something essential. Missing someone doesn't mean you should return. It means you allowed yourself to care. The difference mattered. I also noticed how my body responded to honesty. How tension eased when I didn't suppress discomfort. How clarity brought calm, even when it hurt. Pain with integrity felt different than pain with avoidance. Cleaner. More direct. I stopped narrating my life as a mistake, and started seeing it as a transition. One evening, while sitting alone, I felt something unfamiliar. Stillness. Not emptiness. Not sadness. Just stillness. I wasn't trying to fix anything. I wasn't replaying conversations. I wasn't anticipating outcomes. I was simply there. That moment didn't last long. But it mattered. It showed me that peace isn't a destination. It's a moment you notice when you stop running from yourself. As days turned into weeks, I stopped counting time since the separation. Not because it didn't matter. Because it no longer defined me. I began to imagine a future again. Not a detailed one. Just the possibility of one shaped by intention rather than obligation. I didn't rush toward connection. I let solitude teach me. It taught me that identity doesn't disappear when a relationship ends. It reveals what had been muted. It taught me that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. Most importantly, it taught me that choosing yourself isn't an act of rejection. It's an act of responsibility. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment something unexpected happened. A conversation, a realization, a shift that made me understand that growth isn't linear and healing doesn't arrive the way we imagine. Because sometimes, the most meaningful change begins when you're no longer looking for it. There's a moment in healing that doesn't announce itself. No breakthrough, no revelation, no sudden happiness. Just a quiet realization that you're no longer waiting for something to fix you. I noticed it one ordinary morning. Nothing special had happened. I woke up before the alarm. The room was quiet. The city outside hadn't started moving yet. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to explain my life to myself. That surprised me. I had grown used to constant internal narration, justifying choices, rehearsing conversations, preparing defenses. That morning, there was none of that. Just presence. I made coffee slowly, not to distract myself, not to fill time, but because I wanted to. That distinction mattered more than it should have. I realized then that I wasn't thinking about her first thing in the morning anymore. Not because she didn't matter, but because my inner world had expanded beyond loss. Healing hadn't erased the past. It had placed it in context. I still remembered her laugh. Still felt a tightness when certain songs played. Still wondered how she was doing. But those thoughts no longer pulled me backward. They passed through. That's when I understood something important. Closure isn't about answers. It's about orientation. I wasn't facing the past anymore. I was facing myself. Later that day, I ran into someone who knew both of us. They hesitated before speaking. Chose their words carefully. "How are you really?" they asked. I paused. Not because I didn't know, but because the answer had changed. "I'm honest," I said. They smiled, confused. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't pretend I'm fine when I'm not," I said. And I don't pretend I'm broken when I'm not either. That conversation stayed with me, because it captured something I hadn't been able to articulate. I wasn't healed. I was integrated. I had stopped trying to separate strength from vulnerability, or confidence from doubt, or independence from longing. They could exist together. I began to live differently after that. Not dramatically, subtly. I said no without apology. I expressed preferences without rehearsing. I allowed silence without rushing to fill it. I stopped trying to be the stable one in every room, and discovered that stability grows naturally when you're aligned. There were still difficult days. Days when loneliness resurfaced. Days when memories felt heavy. Days when I questioned my choices again. But those days no longer defined me. They informed me. I learned that regression isn't failure. It's part of integration. One evening, months later, I sat across from her again. Not planned. Not dramatic. Just coincidence. We talked carefully, kindly, without expectation. She looked different. So did I. I think we both did the best we could, she said. I think so too, I replied. There was no need to revisit the past. No need to rewrite it. We had both grown in different directions. And that was okay. Walking away from that meeting, I didn't feel sadness. I felt gratitude. Gratitude for having loved honestly. For having chosen truth. For having survived the discomfort of becoming. That's when I realized the final lesson this experience gave me. A meaningful life isn't built by avoiding pain. It's built by choosing integrity even when pain is unavoidable. I no longer measure my life by milestones, or timelines, or expectations. I measure it by alignment, by how often my outer choices reflect my inner truth. Some days I succeed. Some days I don't. But I no longer abandon myself in the process. If there's anything I would tell the version of me who was afraid to ask the first question, it's this. You don't lose yourself by choosing honesty. You lose yourself by postponing it. The life that waits on the other side of truth isn't perfect, but it's real. And real is something you can finally rest inside. This story doesn't end with certainty. It ends with presence. And that, I've learned, is enough.